Look out, you rock and rollers. Sorry, there's a part of me right now that's 17 years old, 100 pounds lighter, wearing platform shoes with glitter in my hair. I was in a glam rock band. I was. We used to play the Orlando Youth Center and places like that. Anyway, I did actually outline a talk today, so this is it. Although I left a lot of air in this one, in the outline, so that I could be open to change. Anyway, here we are in this new space. And so today we're undergoing a change, and I suspect that for most people this is a welcome change. And from the way things feel this morning, I think it'll probably be beneficial over the long term. But, you know, change is often stressful, even when it's a good change, a move in a better direction. In fact, I was looking around. I had seen sometime this risk factor chart related to changes you'd experienced, and it's still out there. Predicts like stress-related health issues based on life events. And each event, which are all related to some kind of change, is assigned points. And the more points you get, the more likely you are to have a stress-related issue. And so big negative events like going to jail or losing your job get a lot of points. But even things like getting married and getting a promotion, going on vacation, major changes in church activity, that earns you points. But don't worry, changing churches is only a few points worth. But the bottom line is that life is change. And often we don't even notice the change happening. It's just kind of a peaceful process, something we take into stride. I watch the ripples change their size, but never leave the stream of warm impermanence. So the days float through my eyes, but still the days seem the same. But ultimately, change is a stressor. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Our bodies actually get stronger when we stress them and then allow time to recover. If you didn't move around, you wouldn't be stressing your body, but you also wouldn't get stronger and you'd get health problems from that. So we become more resilient emotionally and spiritually when we sometimes get out of our comfort zone. And so there's a point at which some stress is actually good for us. But let's start with the hard kind of change. The Buddha explained that stress, suffering, dissatisfaction, unease in all its forms came in 3 different varieties. First, there's pain. This is the stuff that we can't avoid. If you're born, you're going to experience illness and older age and losses and dying, and those things are inescapable, and they're all causes of distress. And then there's the stress of fabrication. That's what the mind creates. So like when we were sitting silently earlier and maybe you were trying to focus on your breath and your mind decides it wants to get up and walk around outside the building somewhere, those kinds of things. Or when you're angry and you say something you later regret, or when you worry about something and then turn that into a source of anxiety, that's the stress of fabrication. And lastly, there's the stress of change. The stress that happens because of inconstancy. There's the law of impermanence. All compounded things are subject to change and therefore stressful. So in other words, everything that's made up of other things, which is almost everything, is unstable and therefore impermanent. And yet we expect things to stay the same. And when we do that, we end up disappointed. They change due to this change that happens because of instability can take some kind of interesting form. So like Bowie was talking about change, every time I thought I got it made, it seemed the taste was not so sweet. So you've thought about the ultimate car that you wanted. You had your heart set on a Ferrari for a while, so you go out and get the Ferrari. And then you realize Ferraris can get dinged just like Toyotas can, and that kind of stuff. And they wear out and all that kind of thing. And so this wonderful Ferrari can turn into a source of stress, partly because the car itself changes, but also because our minds change as a result of it. I used to, a long time ago, worked in Maitland Center in this 5-story office building. And there was a large international company that had the top 2 floors of this building. And this sort of high-ranking muckety-muck guy with that organization, would occasionally come and spend some time there at that office. And he drove a Ferrari Testarossa, a bright red one. It was one of the most beautiful cars I've ever seen. And apparently he really loved it because to protect it, he parked sideways diagonally across 2 handicapped parking spaces. So, you know, that's the kind of fear that we have around change, around things that we like, changing in ways that we don't like. But also the mind being a compounded thing, that it's going to change just kind of on its own. People talk about, well, my car's gone out of style or something like that. Well, cars don't go out of style, but our minds change what we look for. And so the mind wants something new that looks faster or snazzier or has more features and that kind of thing. And so that car that was wonderful when you bought it 5 years ago or 10 years ago now is starting to look faded to you, even if it's still in really good shape. The new job, the promotion, might turn out to have aspects of it that you didn't like, but also you might just get bored. You know, you might have loved what you did for the first, umpteen times that you did them. And so it becomes less interesting. To some extent, this is probably useful and healthy. The stress of change, as I said, can be good for us. Also, if you were never disappointed, if your feelings didn't change, you might get stuck doing things that are ultimately bad for you. You know, it seemed the taste was not so sweet. Think about something like strawberry shortcake. I really like strawberry shortcake. But if you always loved it, thought it was the best thing in the world, and it always tasted like the best thing in the world, then you might eat only that. So losing its sweetness after a few bites actually is healthy for us, because then we get through and we go want something else. You ever gone out to a restaurant and had a really, really amazing meal, and that first bite, is prepared by a chef who really knows her stuff, and you take that first bite, it almost brings tears to your eyes. It's so incredible. And then the second bite, still pretty good. And by the 10th bite, you're like, yeah, okay, let's go on to the next course, right? So it can be kind of the same way in relationships, that sort of thing. Eventually our desire for things, for substance, change because we realize some discomfort resulting from it. So as I was sitting here earlier, I was thinking about being here for the first time and that sort of thing. And I remembered back to probably, I think it was March. March is always a significant month for me. A lot of changes happen in March, not necessarily the good kind. But in March of probably the year before I first came here, the News Journal laid me off. And so I was looking around for things they didn't confiscate my notes when I left. So I had stories that were kind of in the works, and I thought, well, some of them I'll freelance for the News Journal, some of them I'll see if I can do for something better. And so one of them was on the skydiving industry in DeLand, which, if you don't know, DeLand is a big center for skydiving manufacturing and competition, all this kind of stuff. And so I pitched this to some magazines around, and one said, yeah, that would be pretty interesting, but what would make it really interesting? If you jump out of a plane. Well, and it happens that DeLand is actually where they developed the whole tandem skydive instruction thing, and I actually know the guy who invented the stuff that they use in that and all that. So I said, okay, I'll do a tandem jump. And so you're kind of like attached to an instructor who's sort of like this behind you, kind of walking you up. It's really kind of weird and creepy. But we're standing there waiting to get on the plane, and there's a sign over there that says, no matter what, go with the flow. And so I asked him, what does that mean? He said, well, when you jump out, when you open your chute, you're supposed to go into the wind. He says, but if everybody else is going with the wind, you don't want to be the one that's not doing that. So go with the flow of the other chutes, because even though you're doing the right thing, you might get yourself killed. And so I thought about that. That actually became a really interesting teaching for me, was you might know where you want to head, but you got to be aware of the circumstances too. Kai Tian was talking one day at White Sands, and one of his students from Texas had said something about, you know, when you're caught in the waves, you can either fight the waves or you can learn how to surf. And life, I think, is a lot like that. You can't necessarily stay on the direction that you intended, but you can learn how to ride the waves. Things will change, and often we're not ready for them, even if we know they're going to happen. You know, in January, I went out to California to visit my mom, and Koyo Kabose, who's one of my revered teachers, he's the one that I got the Sensei title from. And so on March 10th, I got an email from his son that Koyo had passed away. And, you know, we realized that such losses are inevitable. And that's why I went to see him. I knew he was getting older. And I wanted to make sure that I got a chance to spend some time with him while I still could. But even knowing that this change is inevitable is still difficult. One of my favorite poems, I know I've shared it with you before, it's by a Japanese poet named Issa. It says, "This dewdrop world is a dewdrop world, and yet. And he had lost some people who were very close to him. And he recognized that everything, ourselves included, is ephemeral. Human life might last a century or more, but compared to eternity, that's hardly a breath, hardly a drop of dew. And yet, we can feel loss. I don't think we can be prepared for something like that. I think the best that we can do is to be ready to be unready. We can be prepared to encounter that which it is impossible to prepare for. So despite knowing better, the mind can resist change on some level, even if it's change we want. Young people encounter this resistance from older people as they try to navigate a much less than perfect world. And these children that you spit on, as they try to change their worlds, are immune to your consultations. They're quite aware of what they're going through. So I have a colleague from school, a younger person. I've known them for more than 3 years. I think they were a first-year student when we first met, and now they're getting ready to graduate. And until several months ago, I knew them as female. And now they're identifying as gender non-binary. And I admit I have a real struggle with calling them they. In fact, I mostly just outline talks these days, but I actually drafted this section carefully to make sure I knew what words I was going to use, because otherwise I'll probably mess up and use the wrong pronoun. It drives me nuts to call them they. It doesn't bother me because of emotional resistance or because I don't like the change. I still like this person. In fact, I think I like them better now. I think in a lot of ways they're more authentic in my perception, and they're clearly making a lot of personal progress in areas like health and living according to a greater sense of their purpose. And yet, I make the mistake over and over when I talk about them. So I was talking to Michelle, my wife, about this a few days ago, and I think I probably mentioned she's doing counseling now, and she seems to have found her niche working with LGBTQ plus folks, and many of her clients are non-binary. And so I told her, I'm having this issue, and it bugs me that I'm having this issue. And so we talked about it for a while, like what's the source of my stress over this particular change. And we determined that it was mostly just layer after layer after layer of habituation. For 66 years, I've been conditioned to refer to people who appear a certain way as she and her. And for the first couple of years, I knew the person I'm talking about, that conditioning actually fit the situation. And now it doesn't, because they changed their mind. And so after talking with Michelle, I just accepted that it was going to be uncomfortable and that I was going to make mistakes, but it's worth the discomfort. And I'm also aware of what they are going through. And I'm happy to accompany them on that journey. So there's some good news about change, which part of it is that unpleasant things are also impermanent. So I have this history of cluster headaches. Any of you know what those are? So they're very severe headaches. And they started for me when I was 16 or 17, back when I wore platform heels and, stuff like that. And the first doctor to correctly diagnose them I went in to see him thinking I had a sinus infection. I said, will you treat this sinus infection? He says, what sinus infection? I don't see one. Why do you think you have a sinus infection? Well, I have these headaches, and, other doctors have treated me for sinus pain. He goes, there's no sinus thing. Tell me about these headaches. How severe are they? And I said, well, if you'd asked me at 1 o'clock in the morning when I was in the peak of one of them, if I wanted you to euthanize me, I would have seriously considered it. And he said, I think you have cluster headaches. Let's treat that. And that was the first time in my life, and that was after I moved to DeLand, so it was like 2002 or 3, that I actually got treatment that worked. Well, unfortunately, things changed. That particular physician retired. And cluster headaches are kind of rare, and so I went through this stressful process of trying to find and establish a relationship with a GP who would take them seriously. It took me 2 weeks. In the meantime, waking up every night or two with these terrible headaches, and actually going to the ER once because Michelle was convinced I had an embolism. But what kept me going was I'd been there before, and I knew that this pain was going to pass. And it did. I got it all worked out. It was a painful process. And I didn't have a cluster for 10 years, by the way, so it was a big change when they reappeared. And now I'm going, okay, well, let's see what we could do to prevent them happening again. COVID has been a change, and a change, and a change, and a change, and a change. I was in a meeting, and somebody said, boy, I'll sure be glad when we get back to normal. I said, we are not going to get back to normal. We are going to move forward to normal. And they said, everyone should have a sensei on their staff. But that's the nature of change. Nothing ever unchanges. It moves forward. This very self is a compounded thing, subject to change, and therefore stressful. And COVID is a good illustration of that. Human form is subject to illness. That's a good place to start with understanding impermanence. If we look closely, we see that our boundaries are pretty illusory. Existence is flowing in and out of us all the time through our breath, through the food that we eat, the pores of our skin, and so on, which is why we can get sick. Song says, pretty soon you're going to get a little older. Time may change me, but I can't trace time. I'm not sure exactly what Bowie meant by tracing time, but I think he meant that we can't predict what changes life will bring. There's a lot in life that we can't control. We can't control nature. We can't control other people. We can't undo our past. We can influence the future, but we can't predict it. We can't control it. And yet, when change rolls in our direction, it's still up to us to decide how to respond to it. If we're to remain on firm footing while facing those advancing mountains and respond to them skillfully, we need the ability to steer our direction toward our purpose. Most of the catastrophes we experience in life are relatively minor, screw-ups at work and difficult family relationships and that kind of thing. The mechanism of working through catastrophes is the same as working with the big disasters. Accept what's happened, accept how you feel, and then do what the circumstance calls for. And then when the storms brought about by change have blown over, the work we have done still stands, and it's there to help us weather the next storm. As you know, a lot of people come to me wanting to learn how to meditate, and I often ask, what are you hoping to accomplish by that? And the most common answer is, I'd like inner peace. I guess basically we want to be able to have some equanimity within the reality of change. And inner peace is pleasant, but to be honest, it's not all that useful. Unpleasant emotions are a side effect of being a caring human being. So if you're anxious about giving a talk, that's because you care about how well you do. If you're sad when you think about someone passing away, it's because you care about other people. You're able to make connections. So we don't need to get rid of unpleasant feelings that arise because of change. Just nurture those feelings that align with our purpose. In those verses I read earlier, the Buddha says, those who are firm and wise, seeking the true refuge, will set their hearts on awakening, on the teachings, and on the spiritual community. One who practices thus with body, speech, and mind is blessed in this world and afterward in the Pure Land. So, accept change. Accept how you feel in response to it. And then move from your feelings to your purpose. Purpose will still be there for you when your feelings have changed. And by the way, purpose changes too. We don't have to cling to it when change suggests a revision. In fact, we want our purpose to be focused but fluid. Otherwise, it becomes an ideology, which an ideology is a terrible way to cope with change. We want our minds to be flexible enough to adapt even when it's uncomfortable. Thank you for your attention.